So let me just tell you what we plan to do here is to give the Caribbean Development Bank an opportunity to share with you some critical research that they conducted on the matter of economic growth in the Caribbean region. We've got a distinguished panel, and if I would get my program back. Thank you very much, Didicus. Thank you very much, sir. So that we are going to have a look at the findings of that report and then ask our panel to give us their first flush reaction to those findings. We expect that the panel will then engage in a good conversation. And also, most importantly, we want you to participate. In other words, there are things that you hear or suggestions you want to put on the table, etc. I think that would be very important. So we have a very distinguished panel to look at enhancing productivity and growth in the Caribbean. And let me introduce them. I know some of you may know and be very familiar with some of the personalities here, but let me do it anyhow for the benefit of everybody in the room. We have, on my far right, Timothy Antoine, who is the governor of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, regarded as one of the finest central banks in the world, and done very innovative things over the years, and credited, of course, with keeping the Eastern Caribbean dollar very solid over the toughest of times. So please welcome Mr. Antoine. Next to him is Nigel Baptiste, who is the managing director of Republic Bank Limited of Trinidad and Tobago. But don't let that fool you, because they are a regional bank, not just in Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, but beyond the region as well. Applause, please. Mrs. Jennifer Dotson Isaacs, the president of the Caribbean Congress of Labor. And of course, you know how vital it is for the labor movement to be included in any discussions that we do have and the planning, etc. And there is a very strong voice in the region. The Honorable Gilmore Andre Hofstad, the Minister of Finance of the government of Suriname. And you heard the president of the CDB say this morning how important Suriname's position is within the development bank apparatus. I know for a long time how determined they were to be part of CARICOM. Years ago, I hosted a television series across the region, and most of the phone calls came from two places, one from Suriname, and the other was Antigua and Barbuda. And that was an indication of how determined they were to be in the midst of our discussions. And Dr. Justin Ram, Director, Economics Department of the Caribbean Development Bank, who is responsible for briefing me and making me very knowledgeable about the things that are going to be discussed this afternoon. And I expect that my lessons will continue as a result of the contributions of these personalities. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Justin Ram, Director, Economics Department, Caribbean Development Bank, to tell you all about the kind of research they've conducted on this area of growth in the Caribbean.
Thank you very much, Julia.
Yeah, your mic is on. You'll find it. 5. It's on. Hold on.
Okay?
Yeah, that's it.
Great. All right, I'm on. Thank you very much, Julian, for a wonderful introduction. And I want to just say on behalf of the Caribbean Development Bank, a warm welcome and heartfelt thanks to all of the panelists here who have agreed to share this stage with us this afternoon. Just to say that when I first reached out to them to be members of this panel, all of the responses were a quick response, and they all were in the affirmative, yes. And I think it's all because of the knowing what topic we were going to be discussing here this afternoon. They realized what importance this topic has for our region. So we have decided to do this particular research on enhancing productivity and growth in the region because at the Caribbean Development Bank, when we look across our board member countries, we do realize that this is an issue that needs very urgent attention. Now, normally when we speak about enhancing productivity and growth, we tend to speak about it in terms of macroeconomic indicators. This time around, we have decided to look at this in a bit more of a micro, as a micro issue. So, the outline of this discussion this afternoon, just to give you a feel of some of the findings from the report. So, first of all, I'll set out the context and justification for the study, some of the pillars for growth, and then what I attempt to do is to go into the microeconomic analysis of what we consider to be the real major pillars for growth and things that we need to focus on for the near future. So namely foreign direct investment, how do we promote the knowledge economy, research and innovation, and no research has been done in the region around clusters, the agglomeration effects of this, and I think this particular piece of research on clusters will provide you with very useful insights as we go forward. And here we're not only focusing on clusters at the national level, but how can we develop clusters regionally as well, following from Dr. Smith's very good presentation this morning. And then some of the recommendations. Now, I've tried to compress all of this. Study is about 200 pages in length. I've tried to compress all of this into 10 minutes, so you bear with me as I try to flip through many slides here for you. So, what's the context? Why did we do this study? These are all familiar charts to you.
Done. No, it's not you. It's on his side. No. Oh, gosh. It's gone down. Bring that up, Mike. We got one. Which one is he made live? Okay.
All right. Can you? Okay.
Yes,
Can you hear me? Okay, great. So, the charts here are a very familiar picture to most of us who have been engaging in looking at development economics within the region. Within the region, unfortunately, as we compare ourselves to comparator regions of other small island states, we find that CDB's foreign member countries have been growing less than others, particularly other small island states, as well as other emerging economies. The real takeaway from that chart on the left is that, and I guess coming out from Dr. Liederman's lecture last night, for those of you who were there, is that smallness is not really a hindrance to growth, because we do see other small states growing much quicker than many of our foreign member countries. Now, that's not to say that some of our foreign member countries do not experience high levels of growth. I think we've seen very good levels of growth here, for example, in Turks and Caicos, in the Cayman Islands as well, and on those countries that are on the continents, particularly Guyana, and, well, not recently in Suriname, but in the near past. That chart on the right, well, it's also very familiar to us. We've also have this issue where fiscal deficits have been pretty high, and our debt to GDP ratios have been increasing substantially within the region. Although recently some of our countries have made very good gains in reducing the debt to GDP ratios. Here are just some of the key development and competitive issues, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. The doing business environment, as you can see, we have not been keeping pace, and for many of our countries, our rankings have actually been in decline. Only a couple of our countries most recently have managed to maintain some stability there, and namely, I can reflect on Jamaica because of the many conditions and reforms that they have actually put in place recently. In addition to this, we all know that the region is also very much susceptible to natural disasters. So we are really highly vulnerable. And a study that we did back in 2013 showed that really a large buildup in our national debt has been as a result of rebuilding exercises associated with natural disasters. So really this is an issue that we need to look at. How do we build in resilience into our economies? Of course, last night we heard about the CRIF and how we actually can utilize parametric insurance schemes such as CRIF to help us building resilience. But I think resilience needs to go much more beyond that. In addition to that, we find that our business cycles here in the region are still very much tied to the business cycles of our major trading partners. So you know the old adage, when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches a flu
Cold.
or a cold. Well, for us here in the region, it's not only the United States, but it's also Canada and United Kingdom as well, as this chart shows. Our business cycles mirror those of our major trading partners. But a real issue that we need to deal with within the region is that there's real volatility in our growth. Now, what we're showing here, the countries to the right of this chart, so here I'm showing Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Suriname, Belize, really commodity-based economies, there's a real volatility in their growth. So from one year to the next, you can see you might have very high levels of growth, but the next year, depending on the prices of commodities, growth rates might actually be in decline. So we find here that the standard deviations are actually quite high. And that is particularly true for most of our borrowing member countries. However, the service-based economies, I would say, the volatility is not as stark. But there have been periods in our past where we have actually had sustained periods of economic growth. And here this just highlights some of the issues, some of the periods when some of our countries have experienced good growth. Most recently, we know that in Trinidad and Tobago, there was a particularly strong period of growth between 1995 and 2009. And that, of course, was the result of high commodity prices, particularly for oil and natural gas, but also there was an increase in production. Now, that led to an increase in foreign direct investment in those sectors. And so you can see here some sustained periods. What I'm trying to show you here is that it's not all bad news. We did actually have periods of high economic growth for some periods, but what has happened now? And I think this study we're trying to examine the major issues associated with declining growth rates and perhaps high levels of debt. Now, we've also looked at where do our borrowing member countries stack up with respect to the stages of development. And here I'm showing 3 stages that the researchers have identified. Factor-driven, stage 2, efficiency, and stage 3, an innovation-driven economy. When we look at some of our economies, we're able to actually classify them within some of these. So Barbados, we're seeing, is actually is a transition between stages 2 and 3. Jamaica, we think, is now in the efficiency stage. Trinidad and Tobago, much more of a diversified economy, we believe is in the innovation stage. Guyana in efficiency stage, and Suriname is now transitioning between stages 2 and 3. And again, in this chart, I'm showing what's the overall levels of competitiveness. Where do these countries rank with respect to the doing business indicators? Growth trajectory, I just thought I'd show you this. What's actually driving growth in many of our economies? An investment in labor productivity, capital productivity, but in many ways it's what we call total factor productivity. How do we manage to turn whatever inputs we are putting into the production process, how quickly we can, I guess, transform those into meaningful outputs, as it were, for export markets or even for domestic markets. And this chart just shows you a bit of what the analysis has actually shown. Total factor productivity. Now, again, I need to make a plug here, because it's been very difficult for us to get data on most of our borrowing member countries for some of the data that will allow us to do meaningful assessments. So if we looked at total factor productivity, but we were able to get that information for 3 of our countries. Here, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Tobago. Barbados, we can see that total factor productivity has been in decline, perhaps now stabilizing. Jamaica was in great decline, now stabilizing. We're perhaps likely to see total factor productivity increasing in Jamaica over the near term. And Trinidad and Tobago, over the recent past, has seen significant gains in total factor productivity, and which has meant that overall that economy is now in that innovation stage of development. Now, it's interesting here. I thought I would put up for you some points that Sir Arthur Lewis made back in 1955, where he identified these particular factors that can propel growth. One, we need to encourage greater levels of savings, capital accumulation, the growth of knowledge and the application of new ideas. International trade is particularly important for us. So again, coming out from Dr. Smith's message this morning, that as some countries turn inward, we certainly need to always be looking outward. The framework for private-public sector relations is particularly critical. So the institutional framework that allows that to work. And what are the institutions? Property rights, economic freedoms, etc. Now, I put this up here for you because Sir Arthur Lewis spoke about these particular issues way back in 1955. Now, I think some other countries from around the world listened to what Lewis said back then. And we have seen that their growth, where they are in their development cycle, they are much further ahead than where we are currently in the Caribbean. So, moving now to what we looked at with respect to this study. We looked at these particular areas. Where can we look for pillars for enhancing growth and development? Foreign direct investment. We did considerable research on this. Information, communications, and technology. How do we actually drive a research and development culture within our region? As well as how do we ensure that innovation is at the heart of everything that our firms do? And finally, we looked at this particularly new area of clustering within the region. We wanted to find evidence. Do we have clusters in the region? And if there are clusters, how can we support those going forward? So we've taken a different approach to looking at enhanced productivity and growth in the Caribbean. So, what's the evidence with respect to foreign direct investment inflows? Here, this chart shows you what's been happening in some of our borrowing member countries. Countries that have managed to attract considerable foreign direct investment, here you can see Trinidad and Tobago over the last, in the near past, has attracted a lot of foreign direct investment into its major commodity sector, particularly oil and gas. Bahamas has done so very well recently within the major sectors. What we found that it's not a problem for firms, for external firms to invest in the major sectors of our economies. That's not a problem. How do we actually get foreign direct investment into the other sectors? Because that's where we want to be. We want to start diversifying our economies. And this chart here shows EODB is the ease of doing business and FDI inflows. How is that correlated? Well, you can see here that, again, harping back onto that point, if you have a good doing business environment within your country, well, then you're also going to attract foreign direct investment into your economy. So that's quite simple. So what are some of the FDI promoting policies that we need to look at? And again, this publication is now available online, so I don't need to go into all of these. But definitely, first up, we need to improve the business climate within our countries. Remove and reduce the challenges to investors. What are investors looking for? What sort of incentives we need to actually put on the table? How about if we also have investment promoting agencies? And again, I think I also want to make the plug here that when we look at some of these agencies, could we perhaps think about doing this at a regional level so that we can get the economies of scale? And what are the financial measures that can stimulate FDI? Okay? And then some of them, we do have other more detailed recommendations for each of those pillars. What about the ease of doing business reforms? Well, like I mentioned before, I think we're going to see an improvement in total factor productivity in Jamaica. And that's really down to the significant reforms that Jamaica has implemented over the last 4 or 5 years. And here you can see a slew of reforms that have been implemented. And here including starting a business as well as access to credit. Now, a next important pillar that we looked at is how do we encourage ICT? How do we get broadband connectivity, not only to our homes, but also for our businesses? And here we've come up with a schema that shows real economic impacts associated with broadband penetration. And you can see here there are significant impacts if there are greater broadband coverage within our countries. But when we look at this, we can see that our ranking with respect to ICT isn't very, very good. Why is that? Because still the cost of accessing broadband within the region, the costs are still too high. So we need to find ways of reducing that access cost to broadband, because unless we do that, then we're not going to have the type of knowledge economy that we so desperately desire here within the region. And I guess, once more, it's all about economies of scale. And we have to think about doing this much more at a regional level. So there's a real imperative for us to try to reduce the cost of access to broadband, to ICT and broadband. So how do we go about building the knowledge economy? I've just put up some of the recommendations here. MSc training to use digital online technologies. Tomorrow morning, we'll be presenting our study on tourism within the region. And one of the recommendations coming out of that study is that if we want to attract tourists of the future, then broadband connectivity and access to technology is going to be so critical. Here we're now thinking about the new tourism market, the millennials. What are they actually looking for? So unless we keep pace with this, our current sectors will also be left behind. So that's also important for us. And some of the other recommendations here, we support and promote women in MSMEs. There should also be fiscal incentives for MSMEs and the ICT sector. Again, we know that we're seeing small pockets whereby young people are getting into the setting up of applications, using technology in a much greater way. But we think that if there is greater access to broadband technology, then we'll see a greater proliferation of the knowledge economy. Okay. I'm just going to skip through some of these slides because I don't want to. We also examined in this study what are the obstacles to innovation. And here I just put up some of those obstacles for you. External and internal obstacles. And then I think I really just want to focus on one particular obstacle here. Finance. And Nigel, I hope you don't think I'm picking on you here, but I know that this is an area that you would have something to say. How do we ensure that we get access to finance for our micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises? And I think it goes well beyond what is traditionally provided in our traditional financial sector. I think Jamaica provides us with a very good example about how you can utilize a junior stock exchange to get now new types of investment into innovative companies, innovative products. I think this is a way that we now have to think about it. It's not just about accessing loans from banks, but how do we access equity financing for our new industries. So I think that's one area I want you to focus on today. So how do we go about developing research and development and innovation in the Caribbean? Well, I think it's quite simple. I try to put it together in this schematic. How can there be greater collaboration between the public and private sectors, as well as the research centers of the region? How do we start incorporating the research done by the universities? And how do we get that research to the market? Yes? So it's not just about students going to university, gaining a degree, perhaps gaining some type of research degree, but also how do we ensure that whatever the research that they put out there, we can actually take it to market as well. What's the internal capacity? The financing, again, becomes quite important. Now, this is the final point that I'd like to say here. Regional national innovation systems are also very critical for us in moving this forward. Again, I think I would like us to focus on the regional aspect of the innovation system here. Now, clusters. I think the research actually focused on this new area, and a lot of very interesting insights were actually gained from the analysis. We looked at 4 clusters within the region. One, the music industry in Jamaica, the gold and jewelry industry within Guyana, yachting in St. Lucia, and the pepper sauce in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, for this presentation, I'm not going to present the findings from all of the clusters, but just two. The pepper sauce cluster in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, they say in Trinidad and Tobago, they like it hot. And this definitely is the case with respect to the pepper sauce industry. We found that there's an estimated economic contribution of just under 16 million US in 2010. But what's more important is that there are significant backward linkages to pepper farming, commercial processing, and packaging. But there are also related clusters as well. Processed foods and meats, spice industry, packaging, entertainment, and tourism. More and more we're finding our pepper sauces in the metropolitan markets of the world. And what's important here is that there's actually seeds are locally sourced from a gene bank. So in Trinidad and Tobago, they pride themselves on having some of the hottest peppers in the world. The scorpion pepper. Sometimes you find a pepper sauce called mother-in-law. It is so hot. I just want to make one observation here and why I see clusters as being so important. Recently, I was traveling through the Caribbean, as we do, trying to go from one destination to the next. And in between flights, I had a 6-hour layover. So I told myself, between flights, maybe I can go out and shop. You know, I'm in the country. So I went to check in my luggage for my next airline. And lo and behold, the staff told me I couldn't check in my luggage because I had to wait until 2 hours before the flight. Now, immediately I told myself, if this was Miami, this would not happen because they understand the connection between the airport and the rest of the economy. Yes? So in Miami, I would have been able to check in my luggage, and they know I've now got time on my hands. I'd probably now step out and go over to one of the fantastic malls that they have there. Dolphin Mall, as Julian is reminding me. But the reason I say that is that we need to understand how industries and clusters matter to the overall economy and why we need to support it. And there really needs to be a constant dialogue between, for example, in this example is around the airport, but how actually getting that process right can actually bring greater benefits to the overall economy. So there are a lot of things there for us to learn. The gold cluster in Guyana, there are two distinct clusters related to primary extraction and jewelry production. The mining sector contributes about 10% to GDP. The market is predominantly export-oriented. 96% of raw gold is exported. And so only 4% of the gold available is available for local jewelry production. So our researchers, when we looked at this, realized that there's considerable room for value added locally, but we haven't looked at that specifically well enough in Guyana. So there are particular issues that need to be looked at. How do we add greater value added locally? And here we have some of the recommendations. Forward and backward linkages tend to be weak, lack of skill pooling, value chains are not well established. As you can see here, a very small percentage, that royalty and the duties on ore are contributing to illegal trade. So in fact, a lot of the gold, we might not even realize it, is being lost. We can't even account for it. So building on clusters, here are some of the what we need to do, both at the public sector, the private sector, and also at the regional level. Let's just focus here on the regional. What's needed is what is actually required. So I think we need to train our policymakers to get them to understand what are the benefits of clusters and how we could actually start developing this at the regional level. Perhaps we can develop some sort of a regional cluster fund. So I guess at the ECCB it's something that we can consider. And perhaps we also need to have a regional cluster observatory see how we can ensure that we are actually adding value and getting more clusters at the regional level. So let me just run through quickly some of the recommendations. So this is a schematic that we've come up with. How do we actually go about enhancing growth and productivity in the region? Well, foreign direct investment is at the forefront of this. We need to have foreign direct investment, more levels of it now, until we can actually get our levels of savings up so that we can encourage more domestic investment. And that needs to be built on the clusters. What are the national clusters that we have, and how can we actually support that? But ultimately, supporting clusters, we need to have strong MSME development. Okay? And given the demands of the new economy, we have to think about how do we drive innovation. And that's all down to the knowledge economy. How do we encourage the reduction in cost of access to ICT and broadband? So for FDI, there are a number of recommendations here. I know I'm sort of running out of time, so I'm just going to flip through these relatively quickly. We've also come up with a number of recommendations with respect to ICT at the national level. Now again, I'm not going to repeat all of these. This is all now available online for you. We also do have some USB sticks available for those of you who don't want to go online and download the study. There's also ICT development at the enterprise level. What needs to happen there? Here are some of the initiatives that we have put together with respect to how do we develop clusters at the national level. And there's also regional cluster development as well. Now, finally, I just want to focus on this. For a number of the recommendations that we have put forward in this study, we think that there really needs to be an incorporation within national development plans and also at the CARICOM strategic plan level. So for example, the Economic Growth Council, well, we're hoping that some of the recommendations coming out of this report would influence how the Economic Growth Council goes about enhancing growth in Jamaica, as well as the OECS Growth and Development Strategy, Trinidad and Tobago's Economic Advisory Board and their new Vision 2030 document. And more importantly, at the regional level, the heads of government has actually set up quite a few regional commissions, particularly on the economy, human resource development, and ICT. And again, there are other initiatives at the regional level whereby we think many of the recommendations can be useful through our development partners. Currently, the CDB works very closely with the World Bank on the Caribbean Growth Forum, that's the CGF, and then there's also the Future of Caribbean Development. So, colleagues, sorry that I have to run through so many recommendations and the findings of this report, but it's very difficult to try to compress all of this within a few minutes. So, Julian, I'm going to hand it back to you there.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So there's a lot of food for thought. I suspect that if anybody was preparing for an election, they would just pick up this document and run with it, right? All right. But the next person I'll invite is not a politician, so he's on safe ground in his responsibility as the governor of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. I'm sure there are a number of things that would have struck you from the findings of the Caribbean Development Bank study. And let me give you a chance, Dr. Antoine, to proceed on it. Mr. Okay.
Thank you.
Let me just cover you with this. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Julian. Let me start by welcoming the fact that CDB has, in fact, put this issue on the agenda this year, the issue of growth, as we grapple with finding a way to elevate the trajectory of inclusive growth in our region. I also want to thank the bank for the courtesy of inviting me to share perspective. And to you, Justin, for your leadership, because I want to say this, because I really believe that the focus will be on bringing these flagship publications to the market, to the board, to the region, is in fact very welcome. and very useful as we grapple with the issue. So I want to thank you for that as leader of the economics team. Now, while the focus, so the report is very useful. A lot of items on the menu, and if I had a single criticism, there would be two. One would be that perhaps it could have had an action plan with some immediate, medium, and long-term priorities, because it's a big menu, and one could easily get overwhelmed. It could be daunting. Which do we tackle first? Because capacity is always a constraint in our region. But we'll figure that out. The second issue, which in my view was a major omission, is the issue of not focusing on labor productivity. The reality is that from all that I have seen, productivity is in decline in our region. All evidence I've seen, both factor and labor. And on top of that, when you take into account that in our persons who actually work, in the people who are employed, employment engagement is very low. Some argue it's somewhere between 25 and 30%. So it's double jeopardy. High unemployment, and then on top of that, you have low employee engagement. So even the people who are working are not fully engaged. That's the problem. So that's double jeopardy. But I'm sure you will pick up that in due course. Now, before I speak about a couple of macro issues, I want to make a serious plug on the macro side for fiscal responsibility frameworks. Because you pointed out that the study found that there's a lot of volatility in the growth performance of our region. And therefore, I strongly want to encourage all of our governments to move to fiscal responsibility frameworks that essentially allow you to deploy counter-cyclical fiscal policy, especially in times of downturn. And as somebody who was a financial secretary for a long time, I know for a fact that the last recession was made more difficult, or it was more severe and more protracted because of the fact that most of our countries could not deploy counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Essentially, it is when the economy is up, you spend a bit less, you save. When the economy is down, you spend more to cushion the effects. As we speak, I know that Jamaica now has that legislation. I know Grenada has it, Anguilla has it. Maybe I'm missing a couple more. I'd love to see us get to that, because we have to protect the entire macroeconomy from the boom and bust syndrome. And I think fiscal responsibility legislation can help. So that's on the macro side. Now, flipping to the micro side, I want to start off by talking about ICT very briefly. ICT is the game changer. Technology is the game changer. The report found that we have a reasonable access to ICT. We could be better, but reasonable. But here's what. Most of it is used for personal consumption, for entertainment, and not for production, for consumption and entertainment. That's a problem. That is also an opportunity. So my own view is that we need to better leverage ICT. So let me give two quick examples. I cannot understand how in 2017 we are still filling out immigration forms at the airports. And frankly spoken, the smaller the country, the longer the form. That's a problem. That is a problem. Now, when you go to the larger countries, we're not doing that. So somebody remarked yesterday, it seems that when we get to the Caribbean, we see these forms, because many of us travel a lot, and as you go globally, you don't see those forms. We have to get away from that. Now, I'm hoping that the Advanced Passenger Information System, which is imminent, as I understand it, will not just address border security, which is ostensibly what it is there for, but it would also enable us on productivity. In other words, we'll be able to use this thing in an effective way. There must be a way for tourism to collect tourist arrivals without us having to fill out these long forms. So that's immediate, but that's real. The second simple example is the use of our smartphones. The reality is that, as I understand it, as much as 70%, now it's lower in some countries, so that's not a hard figure for every country, of our payments are done by cash or checks, paper-based. In 2017, hello? No, that's not good enough. We have to be able to use more electronic payments. We have to be able to do that. Imagine a tourist comes off a ship and jumps in a taxi, and he wants to pay the taxi by a card, and the taxi cannot transact. They have no point of terminal. They don't have no smartphone that can, with an app to do it. What happens? they've lost that business. That's that's competitiveness at the micro level. So these are simple examples. What I'm saying is the technology already exists. We've already paid for it. Hard foreign exchange. But the reality is that we're not optimizing the use of that foreign exchange. That's a simple example. But to me, in both examples, both the immigration form and the question of payments, we have an opportunity now as a region to increase both productivity and competitiveness with some leadership at the level of government partnering with the private sector. And I want to encourage us to move in that direction with speed. Those are just two very simple examples. Now, having said that on ICT, the report found that costs are still relatively high, and that is a major concern. Because when you look, especially for SMEs, which are very important in terms of employment and growth in our region, it's prohibitive. And it is made worse by the fact that in some of our markets, we deal with monopoly situations. So it seems that if we've gone back in some sense, we've regressed from a time when there was competition in the telecom sector to a situation in some of our countries where it now is a monopoly situation all over again. And what we've seen is poor service or decline in service, higher costs, and overall that's not helping. So we're going to have to help our SMEs by addressing this question at the level of government policy, working with the private sector. Two more comments, because I'm given 3 minutes to make an initial reaction. And I'm sure he didn't say whether that was EC or US, so I will take it that is
EC.
TCI in US dollars. But let me just say two other things and I'll stop. I'm sure other issues will come up as we go. You can't get away from looking at human capital on this question of productivity. And in that regard, we are not getting the best bang for a buck in education. The report clearly shows shortages in skills. I have made the argument time again, I'm not alone, that there's an obsession with subjects in our region and not enough focus on skills. And so you have the situation where you come out with 17 subjects, but you do not have skills to navigate and negotiate the labor market. And then you still have to import labor. High unemployment, but you're still importing skilled labor to do certain jobs. That cannot be. So I will leave that there for now. Final point at this stage is integration, regional integration, and clusters. The central bank is an example of that. One of the finest qualities about the ECCB is the fact that we have a pool of foreign reserves. And you know what is the other finest quality? We can't print money because no one government can direct the central bank so to do. Those are examples that commend themselves to our region, and I'll leave it at that at this minute.
Thank you very much, Governor. Well, I think you raised a couple of things that must have excited Nigel Baptiste with opportunities for further innovation as far as the banking sector is concerned. And Nigel, you're really representing the private sector here. So go right ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I think that very point alone, Julian, probably speaks volumes to why we have not been able to progress as much as we would have liked to progress. But if I start initially with commenting on the actual study, I had the opportunity to preview some of the extracts which Justin and his team sent. And I would say it was a very good study. It was a very good academic exercise. I think 100 plus pages, Justin, you made reference to it. I think it's very good that you have it on a USB stick, because the point that you raised in one of your slides that you showed, that in 1955, Sartor Lewis had identified a number of constraints to the Caribbean moving forward. And yet still here we are 62 years later, and we have not progressed. In that intervening 62 years, many similarly very good academic exercises have been undertaken by a number of very intelligent people in the Caribbean. In those days, we did not have USB sticks. So those reports really are on someone's shelf, sitting down there with nothing happening to it. And I do have a fear that this report will probably also go the same place. And when I ask myself the question, why, and I think it's a question that all of us need to ask, why? Why the Caribbean, with some of the more intelligent people, a fairly small population, why have we not been able, in spite of all of the excellent academic work that has been undertaken on our behalf, why have we not been able to progress? Why have so many other territories who per capita have the same amount of intelligent people that we have, why have they been able to progress faster or further? And my attention was drawn to some retardants. And Justin made reference to the fact that Jamaica had an Economic Growth Council. And this Economic Growth Council in Jamaica identified a number of retardants to Jamaica moving forward, and then systematically set about dismantling those retardants. And what I found was very good about what they did is it really started, first of all, with speaking truth to ourselves. And I think as we go through, hopefully this afternoon, and we have some conversations, that we try and speak some truth to ourselves. The Jamaicans certainly spoke truth to themselves, and then they have been able to begin to move forward. And here's some of their truths, and I'm going to read it out, what their growth retardants were. And I would like each of us, for our own respective countries, to ask ourselves if that might also be true for our countries. The first was political immaturity. And in this respect, they make reference to political tribalism and the role of the government in the environment. And quite frankly, it was too large a role for the government in the environment. The second was a lack of leadership, and a lack really here of selfless leadership. And I understand that yesterday at the lecture, reference was made to the fact that the Caribbean is lacking in this selfless leadership. The Jamaicans recognized that, and they listed that as one of their retardants. But arising out of that, they also mentioned the fact that they were unable to focus on a goal. So that as a country, Jamaica had previously been unable to focus on a goal. And I tell you, when I went through these retardants, I felt that almost all of them applied to Trinidad. And in some of the other countries that we operated in, I believe that many of them also apply. So let me just list them without giving a commentary on them. Lack of focus on a goal, low population level, weak executing ability, fiscal mismanagement, macroeconomic weaknesses, poor physical infrastructure, difficult to do business, crime and corruption, high cost of capital, energy, and telecommunications, unproductive labor force, absence of economies of scale, and price takers for all commodities. So we can each assimilate that in our mind, and this is not original. It's on a website that the Economic Growth Council from Jamaica has published. And we need to ask ourselves, how do we overcome those retardants for our own respective jurisdiction? The reality is that the population doesn't care whether it's a macroeconomic reason or a microeconomic reason that is preventing the growth from happening. All they know is that the growth is not happening. And I believe that if we start with a selfless leadership, then we will be able to begin to move ourselves forward from there. I mean, I can comment and discuss on any of the financial matters when we have the open discussion.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Well, I think that Jennifer Dotson, Isaac, you have a very tough road to hoe, only because a number of the matters raised here really call on the labor side of the Caribbean to respond to the challenge, particularly with productivity. What say you?
A pleasant good afternoon to everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to be here, and I wish to thank the Caribbean Development Bank for inviting me to be a part of this esteemed panel. I feel good to be a part, but however, as I already pointed out to Dr. Ram, I felt that labor has been left out of the study, and that obviously he said to me that they will be doing a more intense study on labor. So my outlook, of course, is going to be very different sitting here from the experts in banking and in the private sector, because as far as I'm concerned, labor was left out of the study. And I think more needs to be done as it relates to the most important commodity to productivity and economic growth, which is labor. When we look at it, productivity has really been discussed quite widely, and we will see that in a number of our territories that productivity councils have been established. We can look at countries like Jamaica, Barbados, and Lucia, and Trinidad and Tobago, who all have productivity councils. Therefore, we must ask ourselves, why is productivity so important? And it is really a crucial determinant of economic growth and a vehicle towards prosperity and higher standards of living, large and persisting differences in productivity levels between countries, sectors, and between firms of different sizes, and are therefore an important concern to everyone. The business sector must be aware of productivity levels since it impacts their profitability. But the trade union or workers must also be concerned about it since it has implications for their wages and their basic standard of living. Over the period of 1960 to 2015, there's been a general decline in the average annual growth for the region. The average annual growth rate fell from approximately 6% in the 1960s to 1% in the recent years. And this, of course, comes from the Caribbean Development Bank study. The Caribbean consists of various islands, which we know are small island sustainabilities, small island developing states that are, of course, oceanic in nature. And we know that we experience natural disasters. We have external shocks, extreme reliance on international trade and fragile environments. And of course, our growth and development is hindered by the high communication, transportation, and energy costs, irregular international transport volumes, disproportionate expensive public administration and infrastructure due to their small size, and little or no opportunity to create economies of scale. Most of these countries now realize the need to move towards low carbon, climate resilient economies, as set out in the Caribbean Community CARICOM implementation plan for climate change resilient development. And there are just a few questions that we need to ask ourselves as we look at productivity and economic growth. And the four fundamental questions it relates we need to ask ourselves: one, why is this so? Two, who is to blame? Three, should we be involved in a blame game? And four, is productivity solely a management issue, or is it the responsibility of workers' organizations also? And now, why are productivity levels so low in the Caribbean? This low productivity level is attributed to firm capabilities as a significant constraint to productivity growth. And there are, of course, a number of policy responses that can help address firm capability gaps, which includes facilitating access to business development services for small and medium enterprises, which also include access to finance, skills, market, knowledge, entrepreneurship, and access to global production chains, which you heard coming out from the study. We also need to look at firm level of performance, widespread correspondence between low productivity and poor working conditions. The relationship between productivity and working conditions are complex, and they run in both directions. Evidence suggests that integrated approaches that promote better labor practices by linking them to core business systems and operations, or models that focus on modern management practices that involve worker training and engagement, can bring double dividends. I'll say that again. Modern management practices that involve worker training and engagement can bring double standards. And I think one of the panelists referred to a study, of course, done by the IDB, where it says that a number of our graduates coming out of high school may, as he said, come out with many qualifications, but yet have no soft skills to really function in the workplace. For the informal firms, improvement in working conditions or formalization can make a big difference and improvements in productivity. Who is to blame for productivity being low? No one person or organization can be held responsible for low productivity, as all stakeholders are a part of the increase or decrease in productivity in various Caribbean countries. All stakeholders must have a vested interest in improving the productivity levels of their country. Should we be involved in the blame game? The answer, of course, is no. No one should take full responsibility for productivity in any country, again, as all stakeholders, not just the private sector, but also labor must also be involved in decisions. We also must look at social dialogue, which is important for this to happen, meaning that governments, the private sector, labor, civil society, must all be willing and open to talk and listen to each other and to be honest with where we are as a territory, as various countries, and be able to work together to come up with a plan for the same. I just want to wrap up and say, I know I'm running on a little bit long, that social dialogue is really something that is big in the trade union movement. And this, of course, is the bedrock for labor relations. And this must happen at the policy and enterprise level in order to see progress. This is a key ingredient for productivity to improve where there are honest and frank discussions at the bipartite and tripartite levels. That is very, very important. Further building firm capabilities can improve productivity and growth by establishing, as Dr. Ram spoke about, cluster developments, such as those that facilitate networks, market linkages, and access to services. It is important to look at approaches based on the Kaizen or lean manufacturing, and including the ILO SIMPRO and SCORE program. Other management systems and techniques that can be used are the skills of total preventative maintenance and quality management systems. Business profits will increase with greater productivity. And as I said, it's through the workers of the region who must be educated and trained on the importance of productivity and economic growth. And education and training, of course, and a knowledge base was a big factor that Dr. Ram spoke about in the study. We must also look at the decent work agenda and ultimately the wages of workers throughout the region. Further education and training will produce a more skilled workforce and the ability to retool workers for jobs that may become redundant. If investments are made in the area of education and training, the benefits are insurmountable, and these include increased staff morale, job satisfaction, highly motivated employees, readiness to embrace new technologies and trends, flexibility, creativity, and an innovative workforce, decrease in the turnover of employees, improved image and status of the company, and productivity and efficiency will increase the finances for the company. Really, as I conclude, I wish to say we must all work together to ensure that the Caribbean region is more productive. Ultimately, this will increase economic growth and it will improve the welfare of all of our citizens. Caribbean territories must provide greater financing and incentives, as I said, to encourage entrepreneurship, small and medium enterprises and innovation. All stakeholders must work together through social dialogue to ensure that our countries form tripartite productivity national councils. And as you heard me say earlier, there are only 4 countries within the region who have productivity councils. So I challenge each and every one of us to go back to our various countries and establish productivity councils. We also must have social dialogue at the foundation. We must learn to talk. And people, when I say social dialogue, I'm talking about us talking. That does not mean that we will agree, but it is important to understand each other's positions. And hopefully by understanding each other's positions, we'll be able to come a little closer together. So we must not be afraid to talk to the trade union movement. We must not be afraid to talk to the employers. We must not be afraid to talk to government. We must all be able to sit down in the room and to come up with ideas and ways to enhance productivity and improve our economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dotson Isaacs. Well, there's one politician in the panel, Minister of Finance of Suriname, and I'm sitting here saying, well, just ask him his reaction to the report and done. That might be the safest way.
Thank you, Julian. Good afternoon to all of you. to Justin, Caribbean Development Bank, for making me part of this distinguished panel. I have enjoyed it so far. I'm very pleased with your study, and I think it's time that we finally start picking up the pieces again where Arthur Lewis left and a couple of hours before us in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I think Nigel mentioned that a lot had ended up probably in the dusted offices. I don't hope that the USB drives will end up somewhere lost and that we really start using it. Julian introduced me as the only politician in this group, and honestly, when I looked at the team, I said, you know, the governor of the central bank of the ECCB is a former finance secretary. And I've been a central banker for more than 25 years before I moved into the Ministry of Finance. And I can tell you that has been a mind-boggling experience. So I'll try to look at both sides. I will be very critical, especially on government, but I think there is something that we should blame. That we are small, vulnerable to price shocks and natural disasters. It's not now that we know it. We had hurricanes in the 60s, in the 70s. We had price shocks in those decades. And it seemed like we have never learned from our past. I still remember one of my professors, Claudio Roser, was later director of the Western Hemisphere Department at the fund. And he said, you know, governments always believe that the good times gonna last forever and the bad times will be very short. And believe me, and that was in the 80s, it's always the other way around.
Yeah, the reverse.
And this is what we have been experiencing. If we compare ourselves with other regions, then if we look at the constraints that Louis mentioned, the 50s were the time of war in Asia. The 50s, many Asian countries and islands had GDPs much lower than us, had human capital less than us, were less educated, and were hardly surviving. 2017, they all left us far behind. So there's something that they did that we didn't do. Besides the vulnerability, I think Justin, you mentioned, and I think we can put it as part of our nature, the volatility in growth. If we look at growth, we have been proud of growth figures over the past decades. But if we look at growth, then we see that growth, the quality of growth has never been deeply analyzed. If you look at the quality of growth in countries, especially commodity producing countries, you see that we have been growing when commodity prices were high. And actually the biggest drivers of growth have been either private consumption or government expenditures. That part that we forget in the expenditure approach of GDP investment many times have been left behind. And that is actually where we rebound when we have times of crisis. I did a study in the 80s, early 90s. I think my good friend Ganga from Bank of Guyana was doing the same. When we used to meet at the Caribbean Center of Monetary Studies, and the biggest issue was really savings, the savings and investment relationship. How much do we save and how much do we channelize? And there were so many factors to blame. It's either the government which was not opening for access to finance, supporting small and medium enterprises, or you had countries with such a monopoly system in the financial sector that even the financial sector was not really conducive to produce growth. So these are the challenges that we have been facing over the years, and if we don't take actions now, we really should be lagging behind. One thing that struck me in the presentation of Dr. Warren Smith earlier today was the appeal for integration. We have the CARICOM since the 70s. Suriname became a member in the 1990s, but it seems like the CARICOM is still, although we integrate, it seems like a huge obstacle for us to exchange more with each other. You know, what is pendant with us is that we talk about open borders, but we are very reluctant to open borders, and not only on goods and services. I think it was mentioned by the president of the CDB that even on human capital we are putting serious limitations, and we are too small actually to move on our own. So I think open borders, removing barriers, and removing protectionism from home industries to make them more competitive, to make them more stronger, would be a great way to move forward. Then the role of the state. If we look at the role of the state, we have seen that we, and I mean a lot of our countries, have been threatened by very poor financial management. We have lacked the needed reforms. I know that Jamaica today is a great example for pushing for reform, but we have been lagging on the reforms that many other countries in Asia have been doing, that many former Soviet republics have been doing even before us, on improving competitiveness, of improving the ease of doing business in the country. These are issues that, unfortunately, they are not coming forward. And I'm not proud to say it, but I mean, Suriname came up with their first investment law in 2002, and it took 15 years to actually create the entity to promote investments in Suriname. So sometimes we see that we do things because we are in a program with the IMF, we are forced to do it, and whenever prices go up again, we just forget about the whole issue. We just go back to where we are.
Yeah.
So we should leverage the multitude of Caribbean country experiences. There have been so many studies done in the past. There have been so many experiences that are not being shared. I think the CDB is a great entity, and probably even a smaller institution like Cartac, where a lot of experience is accumulated that we can learn from. This study that brings actually the experience of many countries in the Caribbean should be shared, and we should pinpoint on the best practices from our neighbors to say, well, that should be the way forward. We should be more, and I come to my own side, and that's fiscal policy. We are not a welfare state, although we try to do it. We have a large middle class, but we cannot spend more on people's welfare than we earn. And if we do that in such a way, it creates inefficiencies in our system. We are not able to move forward. And then we are going into elections, then we change parties, then we change governments, but then it comes up to the same way around. So there should be some kind of reality. And we can't deal with shocks. We can't eliminate inefficient subsidies from one day to the other, but it should be clear that, there is no free lunch in the country. There's something that somebody got to pay for it. This is the part. Educate the people, communicate with them, and say, listen, the government is not a government to provide for everyone if they don't earn anything. You have to pay your taxes. We need to create a welfare state. So let's do our job from both sides. So these are issues that we have to do, and we cannot do it alone. I don't know, I think my colleague from the labor union mentioned it, the dialogue. We need to communicate. I have, and this time I address myself as Minister of Finance, I have learned a lot from 2 years of dialogue with the unions and the business side. And you see that people are understanding and are willing to accept changes when you keep the dialogue open to them. They are willing to accept sacrifices if you're able to tell them that with this sacrifice you will become better off. And that's something that we really need to focus strongly on. And the new technologies, we need to move forward. We need. It was mentioned by the two bankers. ICT is a great way of reducing costs, of reducing paper, but ICT alone does not come with that. I mean, give someone a credit card, and you just have a high school education or primary school education. You're not teaching him anything. So innovation should be a combination of new technology, but investment also in capacity, investment in the human resources, so that people are able to manage it. What we experience, for example, is a large, oversized public sector, and with new technology that would make the public sector more efficient, you see the biggest constraint. People are not educated enough to understand these changes. And then you can come up with the latest model in public financial management. You can come up with the latest innovation on debt management. If you don't have the educated people, you still will be lagging behind. And it's not just in education, but it should also be in health, should be in infrastructure. That's where our investments should be going. And we can only bring that by being transparent, by going forward to the people, by communicating with them directly. I think that's a huge opportunity for us. If we look at outsourcing models, if we look at the gateway where we are leveraging between North America on the corridor from Africa all the way up to Canada and very close to Africa, Western Africa, and Europe, there's a lot that we can gain in the Caribbean. But we have to take decisive actions. And if we have to look at Singapore, if we have to look at Dubai, if we have to look at Hong Kong, then we should do it. You know, if we're all very enlightened when we visit these countries and see, well, in Singapore you get out in line in 2 minutes, and if you have a 5-hour or 6-hour delay, they don't tell you we can check you in. They bring you straight into town, they let you shop, they give you a free ride, and they bring you back, and that's what sells at the end. But we have to start with ourselves. Open up our border with each other, start eliminating barriers, and I think that we will go forward very quickly.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. All right. What I want to do here is to open up the question and answer very early, because it's 3:30 and I'm determined to keep things here on time. So please go towards the microphones. I'm going to pose a question in the meantime, but be prepared to challenge the panel here. I want to ask Nigel Baptiste, really, if it is fair for me to ask you to comment on the clustering findings coming out of the report, because I suspect that your banking operation may very well be a good example of that at work. Am I right?
No, you're not right.
I'm not right. Finally, somebody disagrees with me.
But it is a fair question. I mean, there has been a lot of talk over the years, Dr. Ram, about clustering. You know, at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad, you know, at one time there was a department that was focused on trying to see how we could actually get this clustering to work. And I do believe that clustering can work in the Caribbean. I don't know that it will actually be able to transform us to the kind of resilient growth and productivity that we want going forward. But you know, there is no one action that will transform us. So in that respect, I think clustering is good. I'm not seeing it at the regional level. I'm sorry to disagree with some of the other speakers and even with the president this morning. But Caribbean integration, so integration of the clustering at a regional level even, in my own view, that is a pipe dream. Okay, it is not going to happen. It's not going to happen certainly in my lifetime, I believe. And there's a simple reason for that. And the simple reason why that will not happen is really there are different publics that are being spoken to by the various governments in the different territories. You know, and once people talk about open borders and free trade and free movement of people, but the governments of the respective countries, you know, have to account to their particular populations. And that is always going to be a challenge.
So you're saying the politics standing in the way?
I'm saying the politics will stand in its way. Okay. And I mean, one of the solutions, we're here to find solutions. One of the solutions going forward is what was stated yesterday and what has been more or less implicit in most of the comments here, the leadership. You know, and we really long-term, future-looking leadership. And if we got that, maybe the politics would not stand in its way. You know, but right now it would. So I think going back to the specific question, clustering can work. It can bring advantages. I mean, we should see a lot more clustering developing in the tourist-oriented countries. You know, because we talk about the fact that, you know, there are all these linkages, there's all these backward opportunities, particularly in the agricultural sector, but it doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is because if you talk to any of the major tourist plant operators, you know, they rely reliability of the supply is their biggest challenge. You know, so that while this crop they might get X amount of tons of pepper from Trinidad and Tobago, you can't rely on getting that, right, in the following season. And so therefore they are unable really to cut, you know, with some of their international suppliers. And so therefore you end up really coming and going. If there was better clustering that could be done, that could give you a more reliable supply, and I don't know what's involved in it, whether it be in the agricultural sector or any of the other sectors, I could see it working at a national level or a domestic level.
Thank you, sir. All right, let's take it from the floor. I know you were standing first, but I think the audience would be a little upset with me if I didn't let the lady go first.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. A really interesting presentation and interesting comments as well. I had a question and a comment. So my question actually relates back to Justin's first slide, which was about the growth of Caribbean economies in comparison with other small economies. I think small islands it was comparing with. So my question is, what's different about the Caribbean to those other small islands? Is it just the vulnerability level, which was your second slide, or are there other constraints to growth that are peculiar to the Caribbean? But my comment is actually about the clustering, so following on from your comments just now, that there has been a good example of work with clusters in the Caribbean. So Compete Caribbean, which the UK funds along with Canada, and also the CDB is heavily involved, does work in clusters. It has a good example in the tourism industry in Grenada with the Pure Grenada brand, where that pulled together both hotels but also artists and other people involved in the tourist industry in order to promote Grenada in a new way to encourage tourism under this Pure Grenada brand. Also in Belize, using clustering around shrimp farming has also been a successful example. So I think there has been some work done already in clustering within countries, not necessarily so regional. But I wondered whether, well, maybe it's turning into a question now, but whether you looked at some of that clustering work that's already happened in the region and will again happen under Compete Caribbean too, to see actually whether there's potential learning from those opportunities. Thank you very much.
Let's take the other.
Yes, thanks again. And
Thank you.
generally, I think it was a good presentation. There is, however, a question that I have, comment and question, and it's the extent to which professional services, particularly legal services, are not taken into account when we're looking at their leveraging possibilities for economic growth and development. You mentioned, for example, growth in Cayman. We could do the same for BVI, Cayman, and Bermuda. And the truth is that in those three economies that I've mentioned, it's the leveraged impact of legal services in particular, the trust services, everything, that has led to the growth that they've had. And if we think about it in terms of money, in the Cayman Islands, there's an Oxford study done in 2007, which found that services generally, legal services in particular, contributed 1.2 billion or over 50% to their GDP. Within a 10-year period, that had gone up to 1.5 billion. In the context of the UK, last year, 2016, they desegregated legal services for the first time in their GDP and found that it had contributed 25.7 billion pounds to their GDP, and that gross fee income was in the region of 30.9 billion pounds. They found that between 2004 and 2017, there had been a 73.2% growth in terms of contribution, over 370,000 persons employed directly to the sector, and whereas the economy was going generally at about 1.2, legal services were growing at 3.odd% in terms of contribution. And I find it significant that in our context, even though the evidence is before us, we tend to overlook and not focus on how it is that we can use our industries. We have persons, we're graduating a significant number of lawyers throughout the region. Persons say we graduate too many. I don't necessarily think so. I'm a law teacher and I'm a law practitioner as well. But we simply do not spend enough time and effort there. The same could be said of auditing, accounts, and so on. How can we look at them more? In the context of the UK, I may just say that for legal services as a plug. They found in that same desegregated thing that law contributed 5 times the amount that was contributed by auditing and related services to their GDP. Yet we seem not to spend effort in looking at it. And we, even here in the TCI, as you move forward, and I'm sure the Honorable Premier will agree, it is legal services that is at the core of any move to growth and development that has been looked at. Yet consistently we do not do that and look at it. And we do not support enough how it is that we can build out these services for growth and looking at them for leverage impact. And I would certainly like to do that in the context of Jamaica. I have been doing some work, for example, with JBDC with their mobile clinic on the street law initiative that we've launched. And we've found just how much it is that we're talking about MSMEs. Their greatest detriment is the fact that they do not understand the legal environment in which they work. And they do not get the level of legal support they get. And if you do not give that to them, all you're talking about creative industries and everything else is simply going to be wasted because they're not going to get the value out of it they require. So as we go forward with these studies, I certainly would like to see more of us looking at the professional services and in particular legal services because of what the evidence shows in terms of how we look at possibilities for growth and development in this region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. All right. You want to respond first before?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Let's get Dr. Ram in here
Yeah,
first.
let me just, I'll just respond to the first set of questions
Yes.
and then, sir. With respect to what's causing our economies to grow less when we compare it to other emerging markets or perhaps other small and island developing states. When we look at this phenomenon, it's really around the structure of our economies. There are structural issues. Some of this is historical as well. But when we look at this concretely, it's really around the business climate, the doing business environment. How do we now move from what was, I think, when we came out of a period of, I guess, colonialism for many of our countries that gained independence, let's say 1960s, 1970s, even in the 1980s, there was a need for us to follow a certain development path because we really wanted most of our citizens to attain a certain level of quality of life. And so governments felt the obligation to provide a certain level of, I guess, public services free of charge. Now, I think, as Nigel said earlier, in the case of Jamaica, we need to start speaking the truth to ourselves. And we have come to a point where we need to start following a different development model, as it were. What do I mean by that? I don't think that we can go ahead with the notion that governments can continue to pay for all of the public services that are required. I think we have gone through a period where most of our populations are now fairly well educated. Yes, we can have higher levels of labor market participation, but I think we really have to ask ourselves, can we actually get those people in our societies who can pay for some public services to get them to pay for it? So, for example, can we really afford free tertiary education again? We have a number of people who have graduated from universities. Perhaps what I'm saying here is that there needs to be some sort of a means testing with respect to our public expenditure. And why I focus on that is that we now realize that our fiscal accounts are unsustainable, and that's causing a real drag on our economic growth. Research done by the IMF suggested that once you approach or you start exceeding a debt to GDP ratio of about 60% of GDP, that's going to have a drag on your economic growth prospects. So the bottom line here is that government needs to be more efficient. We can't continue to spend at the levels that we once did. We now have to look at that in a new way, and we have to ensure that now the private sector is the engine of growth. That requires a real change. Although we are small economies, you would think that it would be easy for us to turn around our economies, but really this is a shift in philosophy that has to happen. And so almost as difficult as turning around a large oil tanker in the middle of the ocean. So I think that's really what has to happen here. We really have to come to terms with, we need to follow a new development perspective if we are to be able to compete in the new economy that is out there. And again, coming back to that point about the educated workforce. What are the skills that will be required for us to compete in the future? And as Timothy said earlier, yes, 17 subjects, English, math, physics, but what are the real skills that will be required for us to compete in the 21st century marketplace? Your question around clustering, I think we do realize that there's still a lot of work and collaboration that can happen here. And yes, we understand that Compete, they have been doing a lot of work in that area, and we intend to work much more collaboratively with them. I think what was very useful from our study is that we were able to identify where we didn't recognize that there were clusters before. There are clusters. How can we now try to support those clusters to go forward? And I do think, Nigel, I do think, we have to be optimistic that there can be some amount of regional integration. And again, this is where we're trying to disseminate the information so that policymakers understand the real possibilities associated with economic integration. It's really all about economies of scale. We're able to reduce costs significantly. We open up markets for our private sector, but that then becomes a launch pad for us to now be able to compete internationally. So I'll just leave it like that.
Yeah.
On the question with respect to services, I think these things do take time. As I listen to your comment, I can speak specifically about the oil and gas sector in Trinidad and Tobago that has developed significant amount of, I guess, expertise in oil drilling, refining. Now, with the decline of the industry in that particular nation, we still have the skills there in Trinidad and Tobago that can now be utilized in other countries in the region. For example, I know that Trinidad workers go to Suriname, and now there's a big push into Guyana. But you go in any oil and gas nation around the world, and you can find Trinidadian workers working in that particular industry. So I think we need to see the possibilities, and there are definitely other possibilities from other sectors as well. But these are things which we have to nourish and certainly try to encourage.
Thank you, Doctor. Another question?
Yes. Thank you for your presentations. For the panel, I was wondering, what do you think is the value of short-term investments in policy change, as the bank is increasingly doing, to help implement the action plan and the recommendations of this report on productivity and growth?
You want to take it?
Well, certainly I think there's a role for the CDB and others, World Bank and others, IDB, to support policy-based loans to help with reforms. I think we've seen in Jamaica, Grenada, and other places that with financial and technical support, a lot can happen in a short time. Fundamentally, in all of those cases, country ownership is key. So the leadership at the level of the country ultimately is the decisive factor. But where there is a will, there needs to be wherewithal, as in resources, to be able to do those things. And I would certainly want to encourage the development institutions, CDB in particular, in this instance, to be prepared to do what it has been doing and perhaps do more to support specific reforms to get them driven through in a certain time frame. Now, I am not as pessimistic about regional integration as Nigel is. Am I frustrated? Yes. Am I impatient at times? Yes. But I also know from experience that patience is a virtue in the regional enterprise. You have to keep working at it. And certainly what we've seen in some parts of the region, particularly in the OECS, should encourage us. I mean, we have a single banking space. We have a single securities space. We're working towards a single insurance space. Ultimately, our dream is a single economic and financial space. And there is no reason why that ultimately cannot be achieved across the wider region. So yes, I am frustrated at times with the slow pace of change in our region. I do believe that there's too much focus on the external environment to the detriment of us focusing on the internal environment, which is what can we do to fix ourselves and do what we must do for ourselves, regardless of what goes on in the White House, for example. And not that that is not important, it is. But at the end of the day, whether the US hits 2% growth or 3% or 4%, what are we doing to raise our growth trajectory? And there are things we can do. The business environment is a very particular example. So, to answer your question, can we get, over the next 3 years, a decisive action plan in this region to move our doing business scores up from the hundreds or where it is now to the top 50 in the world? If Mauritius and Singapore and others can do it, so can we. But there has to be resolve with some resources to get that done in a time-bound plan. So that's my answer to that particular question. And I want to keep hope alive on regional integration, so I'm not giving up on it yet. No, I'm not talking about political integration. That's not something I am even discussing. I am looking at functional cooperation, working the areas as we've done in the OACS to deepen the regional movement so that we can have business. So I tell the guys in the ECCU, for example, if I go into a country that has, let's say St. Kitts and Nevis with 50,000 people, think that your market is 630,000. Because in the ECCU, that is what your market is. Now, that's just ECCU. If you take that at the CARICOM level, obviously you've gone up many multiples. But that's the way you want to think. And as the president said this morning, once you get to that mindset and you're able to hit the regional level, then you get in your game ready for international interventions and to be able to engage internationally. So let's keep going. Let's not be overly pessimistic. Even though at times we all have our frustrations with the pace of reform.
Thank you, sir. Question from the floor. Gary Cat?
Thank you, sir, for noticing that this is Gary Cat. I have a very simple question, and that question has to do with the quality of our public institutions. Regardless of whether it is a climate shock or if it is a financial global shock, the quality of our public institutions, fiscal institutions, is a hazard, having been financial secretary. but the quality of our public institutions, I believe, is a significant factor in determining the future of our region. And also the absence of a strong focus on results lead us possibly to not obtaining the outcomes that we really desire. In relation to the study, I think the study was very good, but I think there are other complementary actions that we need to focus on as well that must run in parallel with the observations from the study. I think fiscal rules are good, but by themselves, without that social dialogue which allows for an underpinning of the realities in society, then they are as good as the paper they are written on. So there is a new social construct that needs to take place, a new social dialogue which needs to take place, which underpins the need for development that everybody in the society can buy into. My question then becomes, to what extent did we look at the quality of public institutions and their capability to sustain the reforms that we need to engage in looked at during the course of the study?
Thank you, sir.
Very important point.
Yes.
I think that's key. As central bank governor used to say, the problem is fiscal. As Minister of Finance, I still see the problem is fiscal. The government is the driver, and it's like playing a football match, one superior team against a very low team. If you don't have the institutions in place, if you don't have the people in place, if you don't have the human resources in place, you will fail. And it hurts a lot because it takes time to build these institutions. Without good public financial management, without good procurement base, without legislation that makes you handle public finances well, you're creating a big problem. And that's where you have to start with. Not only that, you need to have the people to understand it. You need to have the people to do the work. And I totally agree with the gentleman, the communication. The dialogue is very important. There is no free lunch anymore. The 70s was different from 2017. We have to pay for some things. We have to explain. And out of my experience for the last 2 years, when you explain, they understand. But it's not coming out from above. It's in constant dialogue. I agree. We can't keep providing things for free, as Justin said. Let people understand it, and they will understand it. On Timothy's remarks on the integration, I agree. I'm also optimistic. I want things to move forward. I even think it's necessary that we integrate. It's not something that we have a choice, but actually the way the world moves, we're looking at more protectionism coming up from above. We need to close ranks together. I think the CDB can play a crucial role. The CDB is able to combine the best practices, is able to pick in the experience from the countries and make it work. You know, it saves time, it saves resources. Just let the leading institution in the region play a key role of bringing everybody together, of promoting good practices which happened in Jamaica or in Guyana or in the ECCB countries. Let's see how it works so that we don't have to go back and reinvent the wheel. You know, it's sometimes it's incredible that you're so close to each other and you can complement each other in production, and you're not able to see that. You're not able to see that yet. So I think definitely, and I hope that with this new start, we can put in some key performance indicators. We have a lot of donors here. We know that they ask for that. And we say that within a year we can come back and say, all right, we have been able to achieve this. And how slow it is, but at least progress, movement means no standstill. And that's a win already. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. The last word I'm going to give to Jennifer Dotson-Isaacs, because there's a challenge here. There's been talk about improved technology. There's also been talk about ease of business. Obviously, those two things will impact the workforce across the region. I'm giving you a minute to react.
Well, definitely, as you said, all of those things and all the questions that were asked, basically the foundation and what we are forgetting are the people of the region and the workers of the region. And in order for those persons to be a part of this process, they must buy into the process. That's very, very important. And I think I heard a number of the speakers talking about social dialogue. It's only through talking and dialoguing with all of the various stakeholders that we're going to get them to buy into the things that we need in order to get the outputs that we want. Too many times we forget the people of the region. And that's going to be very, very important for us as we sit here, dealing with our economies, dealing with all the very difficulties that we deal with. We must remember to deal with people. And as I always say to people, you must remember as you deal with people to treat them simply the way you would like to be treated. And I think a lot of times in our various countries, we forget the very person on the ground, from the janitress up to the director, that all of them are very, very important to this entire process. And we must be able, through education and training and all of this, and retooling and giving persons new skill sets to be able to deal with all of the new issues of technology and advances that we need to get them to buy in to what it is that we see as a future for the region. We must focus on the people of the region and the workers of the region and getting them to understand that if we enhance productivity, our economic growth will therefore be the end result of what it is that we want, and which ultimately affects the workers and the people of the region pockets, their wages, and that is what we must look at.
Thank you. I'm going to give a minute to Nigel as well. Baptiste, I know you got a couple of things just to wrap up there.
To wrap it up. Okay, so I would first of all say I'm not a pessimistic person. I am very optimistic that it will not happen in my lifetime. Having said that, I don't think it is necessary for it to happen in order for the Caribbean to achieve productivity and growth, type of productivity and growth that we need. I'll come back to the point I made earlier. It really comes down, in my opinion, to leadership. I think the difference between ourselves and the small economies, I don't know which specific economies were included in the survey, but the difference between ourselves and those economies was really leadership. And I'm not only pointing the finger of leadership at the politicians, although they do have the greatest role to play. I mean, it's really leadership right across the community. We're talking about the business sector, like myself, labor, right? It's leadership right across. We all have that role to play. Again, this might be a pessimistic comment, and some might disagree, but we are all, by our very nature, maybe somewhat selfish. So we all need to kind of look a little bit beyond that. And we all need to have this long-term sort of oriented outlook. And we all need to believe, that's where I agree 100% with Jennifer, we all need to believe that the actions that we are taking, even though in the short term, they might not be in our best interest, in the longer term, we will all benefit.
Governor Antoine?
Well, certainly, I want to endorse the call for social dialogue. I think that's part of where our leadership will come from. So the government obviously must put up its hand first and lead, but the enlightened and elevated leadership that is required really is a leadership of government, business, labor, civil society, and churches. And we have a couple models in the region that we can look at where that has worked and is working. Minister Finance in Suriname attested to his own experience of the last 2 years where that is concerned. That is paramount to change that conversation in the region about our realistic prospects and also what changes are required. I do believe that we have to be more time-bound. The report spoke constantly about policy sclerosis and inaction bias and, implementation deficits. And, I am impatient with those issues as well. But I do believe an action plan that gets us a couple things in a short time frame. So I'd like to see regional institutions like CDB and CARICOM and ECCB take on big problems and resolve them in a short time frame, 2-3 years. This is the mandate, and come back and report progress. And then build confidence to take on more and to let people see solutions as they unfold, and therefore they are along for the ride. That is what I'd like to see more of. The development partners who are here are key in that regard as well, both financially and technically. And I want them to know that they can expect a return on those investments in our region as well. So that as we go forward and we implement these reforms, they will see that in fact there are results on the ground and we are changing the trajectory of growth in our region. I remain optimistic because I remember as a young boy appearing on a television program and wondering whether the Berlin Wall will ever fall and whether apartheid will never end. Well, both happened in my lifetime.
So, Dr. Ram, you've been given a charge. Break down the walls.
Well, Julian, I think we're definitely going to take on that challenge. And, since I've been at the bank, we've produced a number of thematic papers, as Timothy alluded to. And I think we see one constant in that, yes, we produce very good recommendations, but they just don't get implemented. So we're at that point now, and this year we've taken on the challenge, really, to bring together both the public sector and the private sector to have a dialogue so that we can come to some reasoning, some understanding about what are the priorities for each of our board member countries in terms of economic transformation, but also governance transformation. I think those two areas are quite critical if we want to move the region forward. So in addition to that, we have agreed that at the bank we will support the setting up of performance management and delivery units in each of our board member countries. And I'm putting it out there, we're looking for pilot countries. I know that Guyana already put up their hand for that, and I'm very proud of that, but I'm looking for some more. And those performance management and delivery units we intend to support centrally from the Caribbean Development Bank. Now, this is going to be real granular work. It means monitoring and evaluation at a very granular and detailed level. So, for example, if we're saying that we want to reduce poverty rates within our board member countries by 5% within 2 years, so it's time limited, we are going down to the level of the household and ensuring that whatever policies we enact or take at a very high level is actually benefiting current households who are living in poverty. That's the type of monitoring and evaluation that we want to see. And then we need to have, as we tend to call them at the bank, we need to have bulldogs in these delivery units who are certain that we're going to drive the necessary reforms through. And that doesn't mean that it's going to just be a bull in a tea shop, but really what we're looking for is dialogue, constant dialogue to ensure that the necessary reforms that are required are driven through and actually make a real difference ultimately to our stakeholders on the ground. So I think I just want to leave it there. I know that we have a lot of research still to be done, and we will be doing work on labor productivity. I should say that we have another major piece of research looking at the free movement of labor and capital in the region that we will be publishing later this year. We didn't include labor in this actual publication because we think it's quite a large topic. And we really want to have inputs from a number of various organizations, including CCL, before we come up with the terms of reference for that study. So I think we have begun that process, and you can expect to hear from us relatively soon as we draft the terms of reference for what that study should entail. And I also want to put a plug out there to our many development partners in the room, the Inter-American Development Bank, our various countries that provide funding to us, to our development fund. Please assist us. You know, we're also looking for collaborations with capacities, with universities from your countries who can help us do this research. And again, we want to drive this agenda forward. And that's really where, at the end of the day, that's where we want to be. So look out for the performance management and delivery units. We're looking for pilot countries. Guyana has put up their hand, but we're looking for more, and we are committed to supporting those. And I think I would be hopeful if I can come back here in about 3 years' time and say, Julian, these are the things that we have set out to do, and this is what we have achieved.
Yeah. Okay. And that we've enhanced productivity in the region and growth in the region. Thank you very much to our panel. I think you should demonstrate your gratitude to their... We've got another panel to put in place, and give us 10 minutes, and we will be ready to go again. But our thanks to Timothy Antoine, the Governor of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, Nigel Batiste, the Managing Director of Republic Bank Limited, Trinidad and Tobago, the President of the Caribbean Congress of Labor, Mrs. Jennifer Dotson Isaacs, the Honorable Gilmore Andre Hofdrad, the Minister of Finance and the Government of Suriname, and of course our own Dr. Justin Ram of the Caribbean Development Bank. Thank you again. 10 minutes. Tell them to go. You're only